Invite the speakers up, and we have some time for a couple of questions. Any questions? There's one here, Rebecca, and then after that, there's one over here.
This was super exciting since I am in the business of early years and multi-sectoral approaches. And my question is, how do you, across sectors, how do you negotiate financing and how coherent is that in your previous practice and what you're planning ahead? I was looking at Wales and the work over there sounds like a dream come true. But how easy is it messy? Is it uh,
It's really messy, yeah. Um,
and what has been? I mean, what would be wonderful is what does success look like if you've ever experienced it, and what are the plans ahead?
I think one of the real challenges that everywhere faces at the moment is around resource. I think we've got a really, really positive policy landscape and ambition, and everyone absolutely understands the importance of early childhood. But we also see real pressures on the NHS system and more broadly. And I think it's about really continuing to have those conversations with people about how prevention has a role to play and how focusing on the early years can be really impactful. And I was very struck earlier today when colleagues were talking about how do you get play into hospitals and talking about the immediate benefits for people. And I think we've got a role in helping to get better at that, particularly across sectors that maybe don't realise they have a role to play in supporting early child development. So engaging with housing and others, for example, in that space.
Thank you. So my question is also kind of about investment and funding. There was some research that came out this morning from the Telegraph, slightly surprisingly, that showed that the gap between government investment in over 60s compared to children had grown by 160% in the last decade, 170% in the last decade. And now investment per adult over 60 is like £13,000 more than per child. And that gap is even wider and growing even wider when you think about early childhood specifically. So I guess my question is, it seems like there is all this fantastic evidence, not just on the effectiveness of interventions in the early years, but also in their cost effectiveness. But it seems like there are other blockers at play around like political prioritization when it comes to investment. So I was curious to hear all three of your perspectives about what some of those blockers are, where they're not about actually we don't have the evidence to show that this will save money and this will be effective, and how we can collectively address those blockers. I realize that's a huge question, but would just welcome your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's a great point and a kind of sad place to be, I think. And other than giving children the vote so that their views are equally, I think we have got very strong evidence of the impact of things in early childhood on kind of economic outcomes and life outcomes. The problem is that that is not the way in which decision makers and purse holders think. The Treasury has to report on economic growth in a 3 to 5 year cycle. So they're not really interested in what's going to produce, not with no disrespect, what's going to produce economic growth in 25 years' time, because that's not the metric they care about. And we all kind of thought if we got more bigger figures saying how much we're going to save, then we'd get. But actually, I think we just need to operate differently and say, why are we even here? What does government exist for? Why do we care about growth? We care about it for our kids because we want to give them the best start in life. And so the moral case sort of has to trump the economic one. And I think we've fallen into a trap of a sector of trying to kind of speak within the realms of an economic argument rather than say that's the wrong argument to be having. There's some things in life that are more important than that. And I think that is very different in different nations. Even when I used to work in government in the UK kind of 20 years ago, government had set out a set of outcomes. And when it talked about return on investment, it was what's the best way to spend this bit of money we have to get a return on investment in terms of better outcomes. That was the return, not economic savings. So I think we need to think about how do we just change the whole debate rather than feed into one that's never going to really work for children. the more times we come out with a figure that says we need to do this for kids because it saves money, the more time we're feeding that engine rather than saying we need to do this for kids. And we've got public perceptions. We do a huge public perceptions survey. When you ask the public why they think early childhood is important, they don't really say because of lifelong health and happiness or because of economic savings. They say because we want our kids to be happy. So like we just need to talk about that more and use that as our case for change a bit more. And we do just need to change the societal narrative so that the pressure on policymakers from those who do vote is different. You know, I think actually if you asked a lot of older people, they would rather the money went to their grandchild than their fuel bills. You know, that if you give them that change, but we can do more to make that obvious. And that's why I talked about the Royal Foundation. I hope we can create a bit of that context where people feel that actually what the public care about isn't their own self-interest as old people, but actually is what's best for our future society.
Yeah, I was just going to chip in that, yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, I have very much been kind of, you know, providing that evidence that shows, you know, if you invest now, there's cost savings, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And it isn't making a difference. And I think one thing that we're trying to do as part of the early childhood funders group is to kind of make the case for early childhood, because actually most people care about early childhood. When you speak to them, there's very few people who are kind of like, actually, no, I'd much rather, you know, money went this way and away from early childhood. You know, most people do. So it's just about trying to, for us as a funder, is to try and make sure that we are all lined up and all saying the same thing so that eventually the kind of message gets heard about the importance of early childhood long term.
I can see we've lots of questions, but I'm also keeping people from their lunch. So I just welcome you to thank our speakers in a moment and show our appreciation. But just to let you know, lunch is actually in our Donald McIntyre building, which is across the way. There's signs and plenty of pedal personnel who can help you find it. We also have some nice garden space at the back of the Donald McIntyre building. It's a beautiful day if you want to take some fresh air and re-energize. But just let's show our appreciation for our fabulous panel. Thank you.